such a big turnout, and I hope, as Michael has said, that we do carry on fighting this austerity, because what I was going to say was salam to you, because one of the first things that you see when you see me is that I'm a Muslim, and I'm extending my kind of peace to you all. And austerity doesn't see or differentiate between people based on race or culture or religion, and I come from the Muslim religion. But I'll tell you where it does differentiate. It does differentiate between the rich and the poor, and certainly those who are working with the working class as well. What I'm going to do is introduce the final speaker, but that's not the final thing on the agenda. There's another item after that. The final speaker today is Owen Jones, who's a columnist for The Independent, who's written the book Charles the Demonisation of the Working Class. Owen Jones.
12-year-old who's wandered to the front is. What are you thinking? Just come off my paper round, actually. It's not true, I'm actually 58, I've had a facelift. It's good to see so many people here on Pancake Day. I guess quite a few people here because of a bunch of useless tossers in Bowell, though. I've nicked that off someone in the audience, by the way, I apologise to you. It's great, though, to be in Preston and to see so many of you here today. And Preston's got a very long and very proud tradition. Goes back well over a century. Goes back to the Chartists, the world's first working class political movement who fought for democracy, for working class people to have a voice. Back in 1842, there was the Great Preston Strike, in which people fought for workers' rights and democracy. 4 men died, one as young as 17 years old. These are people, ordinary people, often airbrushed out of history, ignored, written out of their history books. This long, proud tradition of ordinary people organising from below, fighting those with power and speaking out with one voice for justice. Now, I also want to do a shout out to the UCU strike, which takes place on Thursday, partly as a son of a UCU shop steward who's been on strike many of times, along with many of the UCU members I know will be here. I hope the Shallow Education Secretary Tristan Munt doesn't turn up and cross a picket line, as he did in London. I don't know if people know, but he actually was giving a lecture, wait for it, on Marxism. As he shot dead irony, burnt its corpse and laid the ashes across the lecture room floor. I don't want to set Karl Marx off again, because last time he was spinning so fast in his grave you couldn't hear yourself think, frankly, but, you know, it sums it all up. People in the university sector faced a pay cut of 15% in the last few years. It's the most casualised sector outside of hospitality. And it sums it all up. Those who caused the crisis of which people, ordinary people, have to endure, those at the top, boom like they've never boomed before. But people who teach our kids, who look after our sick, who stack the shelves of our supermarkets, these are the people who are being made to pay for a crisis they had absolutely nothing to do with. And we can talk about the Tories and how they failed on their own terms, their supposed terms, and we can talk about that till we're blue in the face, and they have, incidentally. They said they'd wipe out the deficit. Well, you know, they've got, if they're lucky, they'll get through half of it through the course of this Parliament, which is what Labour had been calling for in the election campaign. They said they'd pay off the debt. They've added more debt in 4 years than Labour did in 13. They said they'd bring back growth. Well, this isn't the worst economic recovery since the 1980s. It's not the worst economic recovery since the 1970s. Friends, this economic recovery, so-called, is worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. We're now in the midst of the longest economic crisis since the history books began in this country. That's what they're crowing about. But that wasn't really the terms they've set themselves. And on the terms they've set themselves, they're doing pretty damn well. Because they've used this crisis to push policies they always wanted to get away with, but didn't think was otherwise politically possible. The privatisation of our National Health Service, which they didn't have the guts to put to the British people, as that Tory Nigel Lawson said in the 1980s, the NHS is the closest the English have to a religion. Whether it be the slashing of tax for the wealthiest, whether it be rolling back the state, whether it be attacking social security. These are things that Conservatives get into politics to do, but don't always think it's possible to do so. And that's what they've used this crisis to do. They turned a crisis of the market, of the people at the top, and they turned it into a crisis of public spending. They backed, incidentally, Labour's spending plans, pound for pound, until the end of 2008, which they tried to erase from history. Literally erase. They've airbrushed, deleted every single speech they made before 2010. It's the biggest myth, the biggest lie in British politics. But if we look at the reality of austerity in people's lives, there is as much sign of an economic recovery as there is a sense of shame on the Tory front bench. Not very much, incidentally. The longest fall in living standards since Queen Victoria sat on the throne of this country in 1870s. 1 million workers plunged into poverty since the Clegg Cameron Lovin in number 10. There are now in this country, in poverty, the majority of people are in work. They get up in the morning, they slog their guts out, and they earn their poverty. We have booming industries, like food banks. This is the 6th richest country on the face of the earth, and there are now 500,000 people dependent on food banks. We can no longer apparently afford to feed our poorest people. Another booming industry, legal loan sharks. Wonga, a few months ago, reported a 32% jump in their profits. No wonder. Rich pickings for vultures circling an austerity Britain. 1 million families each and every single month depends on legal loan sharks to pay off their rent, their mortgage, to clothe their kids, to put food on the table, to pay off other forms of debt. We've got 6.5 million workers looking for full-time work. It's not just the unemployed people. It's the army of zero-hour contract workers. It's like a return to the early 20th century when the dockers, they'd get up in the morning, they'd go to the yard and they'd stick their hands up hoping to get work. Well, these days, people get a text message at 6 a.m. in the morning telling them if they'll get any hours that day. We've got a record number of people doing part-time work who want full-time work. We've got people on workfare schemes paid nothing, incidentally not included in the unemployment figures, even as they continue to receive benefits. We have 5 million people stuck on social housing waiting lists. That's a crisis, got to be honest, that was worsened and arose under successive governments. People now forced into overcrowded conditions. In London alone, 1 in 4 kids. In London, this great metropolis, one of the great cities on earth, 1 in 4 kids living in overcrowded circumstances. And how does the government respond? They introduce one of the most unjust and cruel policies inflicted by a government on its own people since World War II, the bedroom tax. The vast majority of people, of course, affected, of disabled people living there, forced to cough up money they don't have, forced to downsize to smaller properties that don't exist. That's the reality of the policies being inflicted on people. But how are they trying to get away with it? What they're trying to do, and this is how they're going to try and win the election, is with an agenda of fear. To turn people's justifiable anger at the fact they're getting poorer and poorer, away from those at the top who caused this crisis, to people's neighbours down the streets. They say to the low-paid worker, whose wages are being slashed by their bosses, whose tax credits are being slashed by the government, don't turn on them. Turn on the unemployed skiver down the road. They say to the private sector worker, where pensions, as we know, have been decimated over the last few years, don't be angry with your boss. Be angry at the nurse next door whose pension is still intact. They say to people stuck on social housing waiting lists, don't be angry at successive governments for not building housing. Be angry at the immigrant instead. Where does it end? It ends with public money being spent on vans spray painted with the sorts of slogans that belonged to the National Front in the 1980s, sent to our proud mixed communities. It's the politics of divide and rule. I mean, here's the irony, they accuse us, and we call for people at the top, booming like they've never boomed before, to pay a bit more tax. They accuse us of the politics of envy. But that's all they promise.
They try and get the struggling people at the bottom to envy each other. Envy the unemployed person. Envy the public sector worker. Envy the immigrant in an attempt to let off those at the top. The tax dodgers, the bankers, the poverty-paying bosses and the private landlords who are milking the system, incidentally, to let those people off the hook. And that's why we need an agenda of hope. I'll tell you why. Lots of you, and you'll know better than me, will know right across the country there is no shortage of anger. There's no shortage of fear either. But there is one thing missing, and that is hope. And without hope, people give up. They get resigned. They yell at the television. They turn the anger on their neighbour. But they don't fight back. And unless we give people hope, people won't fight back. So that's what we've got to do. And I want to talk about what an agenda of hope could look like and how it could give people just that. Firstly, as I say, most people earning their poverty. Not only is that bad for the people getting up in the morning unable to feed their kids properly or having to choose between heating their homes and feeding themselves, but also costs us billions of pounds in in-work benefits, subsidising private bosses who refuse to pay their workers properly. One day we'll look back in horror at the idea you get up in the morning, you work your guts out, you come home with a pay packet that doesn't let you look after yourself, let alone your kids, and that the taxpayer has to step in and subsidise those wages. So that's why we have to call for a living wage, to make sure work always pays, that we don't subsidise these poverty-paying bosses. And when it comes to the housing crisis, taxpayers have every reason to be angry at the billions of pounds spent on housing benefit each and every year. That's not going to the tenants. It's lining the pockets of private landlords charging rip-off rents because successive governments didn't build housing. So our answer is simple. As well as controlling those rents, give councils the power to build council housing, creating jobs, stimulating the economy, bringing down the 5 million strong social housing waiting list, but bringing down the housing benefit bill as well. Let's talk about tax. The fact, as I say, people booming at the top like they've never boomed before. Labour have talked about reintroducing the 50% tax on those, the top 1%. But people, according to the polls, would go further. Why not the top 2%, all those earning £100,000 and more, and use that to help rebuild our economy? I mean, when we talk about tax justice, we hear about benefit for it each and every single day. It does exist. According to the government's own figures, it's less than 1% of social security spending, about £1.2 billion a year. Compare that to the £25 billion lost because the people at the top won't pay their taxes. Amazon, Google, Sir Philip Green, appointed by this government as an advisor on how to slash our services. So we should argue, no ifs, no buts. However rich you are, however many smug accountants and lawyers you have, you will pay every single penny of tax that you are supposed to pay. We'll call for the accountancy firms who draw up the tax laws to be kicked out of the Treasury. They draw up those laws and then they tell their clients how to avoid the laws they themselves have written up. We need to talk about the banks. We bailed out those banks, as we all know. We nationalised the debt and we privatised the profits, but they carry on much as they always did, paying bonuses, not lending. So we should call for the banks we bailed out to be under our democratic control, turned into local banks, public banks right across the economy, right across all the regions to help rebuild our shattered economy. And it's got to be part of an industrial strategy. Now, we've let hundreds of thousands of secure, skilled jobs be stripped away and never replaced. So let's learn from other countries where they don't have the dogma of you let the market decide, the state steps away, it doesn't pick winners or losers, and create hundreds of thousands of renewable energy jobs, taking on the environmental and the jobs crisis as well. Let's talk about rail and energy. As we know, we spend now several times more taxpayers' money subsidising rail companies than we did in the days of British Rail. Extortionate ticket prices, inefficient. The best rail company, the most efficient, is East Coast, which is publicly owned and this government is trying to flog off. So let's call as each rail company expires, each franchise, bring them back under public ownership, under the control of us, the British people. Let's talk about energy as well, the energy companies. I thought it was interesting when Ed
Street and the Tory front bench as though he's a frothing at the mouth communist who was going to incite a Marxist revolution. The reason I thought it was interesting is this. If you look at the polls, the vast majority of people want the renationalisation of energy. Not just Labour voters. Conservative voters want energy back in public hands. UKIP voters want public ownership of energy. That is as mainstream and centre ground the policy as you can get. And at a time when the big six energy companies are holding millions of us to ransom, and elderly people, in some cases tragically, freezing to death in their homes, we should call for energy to be back under our public ownership. Again, democratically controlled by those it should exist to serve. We need to talk about the fact we've got the worst workers' rights in Western Europe. We need a new charter to modernise, if you like, the rights working people have, to allow unions to stand up and represent working people in both boom times, supposedly, when people's wages started falling, and during crisis. And let's talk about childcare too, the fact that the average family spends a third of their income on childcare, unlike places like Sweden where it's capped, and that pays for itself as people can get into work. What I'm talking about isn't extreme. It's not wacky. It's not out on the margins. According to the polls, that is where the British people are. That's why it's an agenda of hope. It links, it goes and talks to what people's everyday issues are. And it gives an alternative to be made to pay for a crisis which people have nothing to do with. And that's where this People's Assembly comes in. I think we all know, let's be honest, in years gone by, people who want a bit of a better world have often found it easier to get angry with each other than those responsible. It's all gone a bit People's Front of Judea, occasionally, to be brutally frank. I suspect some are laughing at our bitterness there rather than anything else, but this time, the stakes are too high. When you've got people driven to food banks in one of the richest countries on earth, when people in work are there languishing in ever-growing poverty, when people are choosing between heating their homes and feeding their kids, we have a responsibility to stand up and fight for an alternative, not to argue with each other. And that's why the People's Assembly is bringing together unions representing private and public sector workers, people from the Labour Party, the Green Party, no party at all, disabled campaigners, youth campaigners, tax justice campaigners, to build a broad movement where we don't argue with each other. We won't always agree, good. All movements are full of discussion and debate, but we will always remember we are on the same side. We can't let those in power divide us, and that's what these meetings are all about. But the reason I'm optimistic, we've got to leave today optimistic. Today isn't about letting off a bit of steam. It's not some sort of therapy session where we all stand up and go on about how terrible things are. We're here because we're going to change things. And we do that by drawing on our own history. We do it by looking back, as I say, to the Chartists, the world's first working class political movement. By looking back to the suffragettes who were demonised and reviled in their day. The early trade unionists who fought for the rights and dignity of working people. Those who fought sexism and racism and homophobia, who were reviled and persecuted and hit with batons and sent to prison cells. People who fought against overwhelming odds and won. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Everything we have, all our gains, all our rights, they're not given to us by the goodwill and generosity of those above. They're won through the struggle and sacrifice of people from below. Those are our traditions. And we owe it to our mothers and our fathers and our grandmothers and grandfathers and our ancestors who built the welfare state, who built the NHS, who won workers' rights, not to let all of that get stripped away. And I'm absolutely confident that if we have courage, hope, determination and unity, that if we stand together, we fight together, we will win this together. Thank you.